Senate Bill 140 and SJR 112, filed by myself and Senator Carona jointly, are an effort to identify and review our state's tax preferences and ensure that they're carrying out their intended purposes and advance more efficient and effective economic policy in Texas. I do have a committee, a substitute for each, and I'd like to address the differences before the two.
We don't have a quorum, we can't adopt it, but you can lay it out.
Yes, sir. Mr. Chairman, as this committee knows well, the legislature makes extensive efforts to determine the efficacy of every state dollar spent on education, health and human services, and criminal justice systems, and every other sphere of spending in the state of Texas. With that data, we can weigh the cost and benefits of different policy options in an attempt to make the most well-informed decisions about what we should do. Yet we still have an astounding deficit of knowledge when it comes to tax preferences, including basic information like how many exist, their cost to the state, and the effect on economic development. And specifically, I'm more focused on the tax breaks that we granted, as opposed to just focusing on any tax breaks or preferences that are granted by other units of government. Our ongoing budget challenges demand that we be as prudent as possible with taxpayer dollars. The legislature needs regular access to comprehensive analysis that allow us to make educated decisions about which preferences are working, which ones need reform, and which should be eliminated or modified in any way. Let me briefly explain the process laid out in this bill. First, the comptroller for Texas will identify each state and local tax preference authorized by state law, and then create a schedule under which they will be reviewed every 6 years. I'm flexible. If the members of this subcommittee or the full committee of finance thinks that 6 years is too short of a period, I'm amenable to doing it every 10 years or every 20 years, but we have to start somewhere. Each interim, the Legislative Budget Board will review tax preferences according to the comptroller's schedule to determine their purpose and economic impacts. The OBB will provide to Senate Finance and the House Ways and Means Committees a preliminary report. The committees can modify that report and will then submit a final version to the governor, lieutenant governor, and speaker, along with holding a public hearing on the issue. Finally, the bill requires that tax preferences created after September the 1st, 2014, have a sunset date of 6 years unless the legislature provides for a longer period of time. The committee substitute to Senate Bill 140 differs from the filed version in two ways. First, it states that a tax preference included in a final report expires on the second anniversary of the date of the report, unless it is reauthorized by the legislature. In other words, once a preference is reviewed, the legislature must affirmatively act to keep it. Secondly, it provides a hard cap of 6 years as a sunset date for each tax preference. The committee substitute to SJR 12 also provides a hard cap of 6 years as a sunset date for each tax preference. I have a couple of resource witnesses that I'd like to bring up. You can bring them up as a group if you'd like to. Mr. Chairman, I have Dick Levine from CPPP, Billy Hamilton, who we all know, Roland Altinger, Harris County Assistant Tax Appraiser, and Eileen Garcia with Texans Care for Children.
Okay. I guess first off, a couple questions. You go ahead, Billy. Y'all sit down. Everybody come forward. My question is, obviously, it's important that y'all come forward, Jake. Y'all go ahead, sit down. That's fine. We've got some other witnesses too, but we'll let y'all testify first. It's important to know the list of different types of tax exemptions that may be out there. I think that's obviously pretty important. But then, do you think that the comptroller and the LBB, how did you pick those two, which obviously, you know, sometimes, say for example, there's some legislation filed that would have the Sunset Commission look at certain things. Well, that's not really their expertise. And so my question is in particularly, you think that that's something that they should be doing rather than why isn't it an interim study? Why isn't it a legislative process to overview, find out, first, should we know what all the exemptions are that are out there, and then take the next step if we decide to deal with it?
It's a very good question. And a number of our friends in the lobby were trying to get me to do another study, and I pulled out all of the studies I could come up with. Back when I chaired this committee in 2001, during the interim, we did an interim study on the various tax breaks, and it became a very good door stopper. And I suspect that successive finance chairs and appropriations committee chairs and ways and means chairs have done studies on the tax breaks. I have an interesting series of emails between my office and the comptroller's office during the interim, trying to really get a catalog of all of the tax breaks that we've given away. And it's a pretty comprehensive job. I'm not really that hung up on who does it. I do think that if you don't have some sunset provision.
Did you say that when you chaired at the time, you did a study? So you have that list?
Yeah.
Or you don't have that list?
I have a somewhat incomplete list that I did as finance chair, or the committee did. And I think that there are probably at least 3 times the legislature has done studies on it. Chairman Ogden talked about it quite a bit, and I think they did a study as well. But there have been a number of them, to be honest with you. The reason I thought of sunset, with you and I having chaired and co-chaired the Government Audit Committee, that was created in 2003. In some ways, I think they were probably trying to create something for a former finance chair to do. And I knew where a few bodies were buried. I buried a few. And they created that committee.
It's being recorded,
oh, yeah.
right?
I said that a number of times. That's been in print a couple of times. You've been in long enough to bury a few bodies as well, by the way. But I just kind of think the sunset staff is...
No, I'm not saying that's their expertise. My point is sometimes people are directed to ask someone to do something when that's not their expertise.
Yeah.
Not to say the LBB and the comptroller are not very comparable officers. The question is there. And so what I would just say is, number one, what I would like to see is I would like to see that incomprehensive list that you did or your staff at the time. I'd like to see those different lists first, if you don't mind. I'd like to do that first before we proceed. And I think that's important. Maybe you can do that for us next week.
Yeah, I'll get that. And I'll get the list that I got from the comptroller's office, which sort of shows the problem. Nobody knows how many. I'm just guessing that there are things that have been placed in the statute in Texas, probably going back to Reconstruction, to be honest with you. And unlike other areas of budgeting, tax preferences really are a system of budgeting.
I think it's very important that we know those lists. We as policymakers, I'm not so sure about a hard, fast rule of every 6 years we have to reauthorize those. But anyway, that's just an initial discussion with me, and I don't know about
here's what my good staff's telling me. Maybe I should have had them do it if we had the sunset power. LBB basically does this already in their government efficiency report, but it is somewhat limited on how they do it.
Okay. All right. Hey, Billy, you going first, or who's going first?
Yes, as you will, Mr. Chairman. Go ahead, Billy. Mr. Chairman, members, my name is Billy Hamilton, and I am a consultant. I'm here because Senator Ellis asked me, and I assume because for 16 years I was Deputy Controller of Public Accounts, and I've seen a lot of exemptions come and go. What are defined as tax preferences in this bill are really ways that the legislature has over time decided to modify the tax system for various purposes, to attract jobs and investment or to accomplish other goals. Usually in economic development, the goal is to remove what we in the profession call sore thumbs, which are problems in tax policy that make Texas or stand out in comparison to other states. And on the other side, there are exemptions to make the tax system fairer, like the food for home consumption exemption. The issue, I think, with tax codes, and you read this all over the nation, is that these tend to build up over time. They're put into the code sort of piecemeal, and they may build up and become a concern. I have looked at a lot of states, and I don't believe Texas has as large an issue as some others. I know, for example, Louisiana is going through and looking at its exemptions now, and they literally are massive. On the other hand, there are a lot of provisions in the code that don't get the sort of periodic review that the LBB presumably provides. The Pew Center for the Study of the States has looked at this issue recently, and they recommend something very similar to Senate Bill 140, but they also show that most of the states don't have this sort of periodic review, that it may be an emerging trend in state finances.
Do any states have?
Oh yes, there are actually several that have it or that they mandate it be done. The one that the Pew Center holds up as the example is Oregon, who has mandates a regular sunset of all exemptions, and it becomes a regular part of the budget process. Now, there's a pro and con on this. I mean, the pro is that it gets detailed legislative consideration. The con is that members often decide that, for example, the exemption for raw material inputs to machinery under the sales tax was a good idea in 1961. It's a good idea today. So you can see what you want about that.
And if I might, I would assume we would do that. I mean, I think my sales tax holiday, back to school sales tax holiday was a good idea in 1997, although Mr. Levine was against it. Well, I think it's a good idea now. But my point is, somebody ought to review it. Was that 95, 97?
95.
95, which I might add, Mr. Chairman, what was added to it? Over-the-counter drugs, internet connection, R&D tax cuts, other folks' bills. So am I still about the fourth largest tax cut in the history of Texas now?
You're right up there, Mr.
I'm right up there. I'm going to pull you back in. You're a little off point here. So, I couldn't remember. I'm assuming you drew a 2-year term then, is that what, by your comments there.
The one last word of caution, I don't want to belabor the committee's time, but the one last word of caution I would have is, as having participated in this study for many years, the controller currently puts out a tax exemption and tax incident study every couple of years. It goes back far enough that Congressman Doggett actually required it when he was a member of the legislature. This year's version came out in March, and it shows an estimated $43.9 billion in exemptions. Of that, state preferences are $37.7 billion, and property tax are $6.2, and those are huge numbers. But if you really break the numbers down, what you'll find is there are a number of issues like manufacturing inputs to the raw material inputs to manufacturing, which cut it down pretty closely. And we seem to be going through an exercise in many of the states where they're trying to expand their tax bases by eliminating these exemptions, and they all run into this issue, which is that they look at them and they decide, well, a tax break for school backpacks is a good idea. We don't want to do that, and then that list gets whittled down, so it can be misleading, and it's often presented as misleading. That said, regular review of these exemptions, if that's the will of the legislature, I think you'll find that this legislature over time has done a good job on most of the exemptions that it has, but there are always issues out there.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Billy. Any questions? Dick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Dick Levine. I'm Senior Fiscal Analyst at the Center for Public Policy Priorities, and I am here to testify for Senate Bill 140 and SJR 12. You've been working in here, all of you who were here and sitting in these seats since January, trying to figure out how to write a budget with the amount of money you had, making trade-offs back and forth, because if you spend money here, it won't be available to spend there. But the problem is there were a lot of decisions made long before you got here in January that determined how much, the decisions were already made, which money was going to be coming in here for you to then make the appropriations decisions on. And those are all decisions, as the Senator said, have been made years or decades ago. And it would be worthwhile to go back and look at those decisions and see if you'd do them over again. Many of them you would, as Billy mentioned, but some of them you might not, but you will never know unless you have a regular reason to come back and look at it. Also, as Billy mentioned, the Comptroller does do a regular tax exemption study, also tax incidence, that shows who pays and who doesn't pay according to business sector and family income. And it's very useful, and in fact it's probably better than most states have, but it's limited. Covers the sales tax, covers the franchise tax, the school property tax, motor vehicle sales, but it doesn't even cover the natural gas tax or the oil production tax. Those aren't in here. One of the reasons, for instance, the natural gas tax isn't in here is because a high-cost natural gas exemption has gotten so big that it has reduced net revenue from that tax below the threshold for the Comptroller to report. But there are exemptions like that you may want to take a look at, but you won't unless you have to. Now, as to an example of what this report would look like, I've given you, this is from the state of Washington, and it happens to be the review of their R&D tax credit. It's already come up in the House and may be coming in front of this committee sometime in the future. And it talks about, in Washington, they have both the sales and D&O tax as their gross receipts tax. And you can see the kind of information. It starts just with a review of the current law and how it's calculated, legal history. I mean, nothing special there, although it is awfully handy to have it in one place. But when you get to page 102, which is about the fifth page of what I've given you, you can see what kind of review this goes through. And it's more than just how much money is not coming into the Appropriations or Finance Committee to write a budget from. It goes deeper than that. Starts with what are the public policy objectives to provide a justification for these tax preferences? Is there any documentation on the purpose or intent? Did the legislature say why they were even doing it to begin with? And then what evidence exists to show that these preferences have contributed to the achievement of those objectives? In other words, what's it supposed to do, and does it do it? And they can look at, for instance, how many jobs are created, and conclude, for example, in this case, it's unclear whether the R&D spending might have been increased because of this credit. If that was the purpose of the credit, you want to know whether it actually worked. And also what kind of jobs were created, and they give a table here of how many jobs were earning over $60,000, and did they get retirement benefits, and did they get health benefits. And then for those preferences enacted for economic development purposes, and as Billy mentioned, most of them are, what actual economic impacts were there compared to the economic impact of government activities that could have been funded by this tax, the activities like the investments in public education, health and human services that you're making in your budget, and would continuing these preferences continue that? Also, who's affected by it? What's the economic and revenue impact? And also, what would be the negative effects on the taxpayers who currently benefit from the tax preferences? Which is a very good question. You don't want to pull the rug out from somebody who's been counting on it. So I'm not just talking about increasing revenue. You have to look at everybody who's affected, not just people who might be receiving services if the money were available for public services, but the individual corporations who are benefiting, or the individuals who are benefiting from the tax preference. And then very quickly, this is the bottom line final result of the review. And it's clear that they concluded that, in this case, the cost of the preferences exceeded the cost of the benefits. That's the bottom line determination you need to look at. And they decided that if the purpose was to create quality employment opportunities in the state, and this is in the state of Washington, it's a home of Microsoft. It's a home of Amazon. It's a very high-tech state. But they decided instead of the tax credit, maybe the better thing to do would be to partner with the high technology R&D industry to provide educational and training programs to develop human resource skills needed by the industry.
Okay. All right.
You won't get there unless there's something that requires you every 6 years or whatever it is to make these determinations.
Senator Lucia.
Thank you very much for your excellent testimony.
Thank you.
I think the Senator, these bills are long overdue for us to really. I know we've been looking at and talking about this issue for a long time, but I think it's high time we certainly have a true picture of this particular, area of government in terms of who's paying and who's not paying and how much is out there. It's incumbent on us to be able to have that picture painted well so that we can address. We're not going to see an increase. First of all, fix the structural deficit, or see an increase of income and revenue in the state. I think that's where we're going with these bills. I apologize for coming in late after education, but I hope that that's where we're going with these bills is to see what tax exemptions are out there. Is that where we're going?
We do, and I also put in a sunset provision for it.
Right.
And instead of, if I might, Mr. Chairman,
Yeah.
instead of me trying to single out any one particular tax preference, I've done that in the past, and I have a bill of the early filer one. I know the retailers are here worried about that. I'm trying to not single out anything. You got the country club exemption, high cost gas. Well, you might remember the exchange from last session where then Chairman of Finance Ogden, who said he couldn't vote on it, but he said, hey, I think it ought to be adjusted, but your number's wrong. So
sure.
I said on the floor, well, what number do you suggest? He mentioned one, and I forced a vote on it. It had 16 votes, but it was on third reading, and I needed 2/3 vote to amend that bill. But so instead of me singling out any one entity, I'm just saying take them all through the process. I dare say most of them would be reauthorized again, but they ought to get reviewed. They ought not be treated as an entitlement.
Well,
As I told Senator Ellis, I think knowing what's out there is important. You mentioned there's been efforts to obtain that information, and it's not a complete list, which I'd asked him for the list of what has been out there before. I do think it's important to know. Now, whether we do a reauthorization, I'm not necessarily so convinced, but I do want to see what is the list first, and then we can go from there.
Well, I think it's important, as we actually, we should have a clear picture before the next legislative session. We're past halfway through this session already by 1 or 2 days. I don't think we're going to obviously do much to address the issue at this point, but it would be important for us to get ready for next session, and this certainly would get us, make sure we head in that direction. I personally want to know whether or not we're going to be able to look at the increased need that we have in this state by finding the resources to do that. I remember coming in 1987 in the House, and the budget at that time was $39 billion for the biennium. $39 billion. And we're looking at a budget of $195.5 billion. Anyway, that's what went out of the Senate. But we've grown, and the need is there, and the need continues to grow. So I want to make sure that we have a fair system when we talk about billions of dollars that are being exempted here, for whatever reason we're doing it for.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
And then I'll be quiet. I do want to make the point that we have not, you cannot get a complete list of all the tax preferences from the LBB, not a comptroller. That is documented. And I would hope that we wouldn't decide to do nothing waiting on a complete list. So at some point, I'm saying just pick some. If not all of them, just go pick 20. And decide you're going to take those through the process.
But you also said you don't need to single any out. You need to have a clear picture first.
But,
Well, I'm not being circular. I'm not being circular, but what I'm saying is I don't want us to hide behind when I've asked for a complete list and the comptroller's documented saying, hey, it's a good question, but I have no way of knowing. So we got to start somewhere. Would be disrespectful when I'm suggesting, but I single them out. We'll probably get to vote on it one way or the other. Something's going to come up with a broad enough caption. Well, there'll be an opportunity. Trust me, in these 23 years, I'll figure that out.
Let's get through the witnesses. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not Roland Daltinger. My name is Sam Stiefer. I'm Chief Deputy of the Harris County Appraisal District. We came up at Senator Ellis' request. I'm also a member of the Legislative Committee of the Texas Association of Appraisal Districts, and we are testifying in favor of the bill. In terms of local preferences, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of property tax preferences that appraisal districts have to administer, and we simply have to administer them as written. Some of them date back to 1876, some were done in the last legislative session. There is no meaningful method of reviewing those to see whether or not they still serve the purposes that they were created for, and so we're very much in favor of a process where you would have periodic review and periodic revision, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
All right, any questions?
Just one. Would you, I know my dear friend, the speaker is here, and he's been giving me a hard time on one of his signature bills. I told him when I go, next time I play golf at the country club in your district, they're going to throw Avion bottles at me. But tell me how that green space country club exemption works.
The Green Space Country Club exemption actually applies to any type of recreational land that has a deed restriction on it that restricts its use to recreational purposes. And it's an unusual statute that the property owner themselves can restrict the land. Once the land is restricted, then it can only be appraised according to sales of comparably restricted land. The effect in Harris County is about $186 million value loss between the market value of the property and the value that it has as deed restricted.
Now that is a state mandate.
That is a state mandate.
So the county or the city that the green space is in, they have no control over it. If they apply for it, they get it.
That is precisely correct.
But now I couldn't do it for my little old home over there in the medical center. I'd like to let folks tee up, do a little putting on my front yard if I can get a break. Well, I can't. I gotta have deed restrictions on my home. That won't work.
It will not work.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for this opportunity. I'm Eileen Garcia. I'm chair of Texas Forward, a coalition of thousands of individual supporters across the state, as well as dozens of member organizations, including Big Brothers Big Sisters, the Christian Life Commission, Coalition of Texans with Disabilities, the Association of Social Workers, my own organization, Texans Care for Children, and many others. And we are in support of this bill. We're people who have come before the legislature and continue to come talking about our own specific priorities and our own specific constituencies, but what we all have in common and why I'm here today is because we have a belief that to move Texas forward, we really need to invest and prioritize Texas people and our public services that serve those people. These investments are only possible when our state looks to our available resources and has the information to make strategic decisions. While every session we see intense scrutiny on all our state investments, there's not that level of review or opportunity for public input or consideration when it comes to our ongoing tax exemptions. And that certainly greatly impacts the legislature's ability to cover our state's needs. As described before, with some $43.9 billion in state exemptions, it's time for a thoughtful, ongoing review process. And I think I won't repeat other points made, but I'll just say that the money we leave on the table, be it an active decision or a passive decision, it's a policy decision that we're making. And what I think is just so wonderful and why our coalition is so in support of this is it makes it an informed decision, an active, informed decision with accountability to it. And so we greatly appreciate Senator Ellis bringing this forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? No? Okay, thank you for each of you. I have Deborah Cartwright, who is Director of Property Tax System, Comptroller's Public Accounts, who's just a resource only if there was any questions. And then the last four cards that I have is Ronnie Volking, Dale Kramer, Gib Lewis, and then Eric Hartman.
Those are they against the bill?
1, 4, and 3 against. Gib, you want to come too? I got 4 chairs.
You need a water in there?
I just need all these out. Ronnie. Do you want Dale to start? Yeah.
Oh, great.
Dale, you want to start, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Senators. I appreciate the opportunity to be here this afternoon. And I commend Senator Ellis and Senator Carona's effort to shed greater light on our tax structure, an effort which we certainly encourage as president of the Texas Taxpayers and Research Association. But unfortunately, I must register in opposition to SJR 12 and SB 140, and I'll be very brief. There are basically three key reasons. First is the sole focus on tax preferences rather than on the imposition of the tax itself. For example, a more legitimate question with the property tax might be, instead of should we have a homestead exemption for residential property, the more legitimate question might be, should we have a property tax with the modern economy that we have today? So there's a concern that if you only look at the exemptions themselves, you lose the basis on which those exemptions are offered, and that's the tax itself. So we would encourage looking at the tax itself and then the exemptions as a part of that, as opposed to only the exemptions. There is a danger in just looking at the tree rather than the forest. I will also say that we have a concern with the way the structure of the review itself. The review is done independently of those who pay the tax. It's a combined effort between the controller and the LBB. The controller sets a schedule for review. There actually is an opportunity for the public to comment on the schedule, but once that schedule is set and it's sent over to the LBB, there's no requirement that the LBB ever engage in any discussion with the taxpayer whatsoever. And we would think a process would be improved if it included taxpayers and an opportunity for them to formally offer their thoughts and opinions as well. I will note, Senator, you mentioned about the old tax studies, and I think that's the best way to go, is to embark on a blue ribbon panel to review our overall tax structure. And you talked about you have the doorstop from those old studies, but I would venture to say if you took all the Sunset Commission reports over the last 20 years over that time, you'd be able to close off the whole door. But in all honesty, the real reason we have a concern with this approach is the sunset provision, because what that does is that injects a tremendous amount of financial uncertainty into business planning. A business may decide to come here and make an investment in Texas based on an exemption that may be in place, only to see that exemption go away in 2 years. And Senator Hager, you served in the House, and you know that there is some well-intentioned legislation that had the broad support of the entire House membership, only to die on a point of order. And the concern is that you could have a very popular exemption that everyone likes, but all it takes is one House member with a point of order to cause a tremendous increase in the tax liability. Thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Let me ask this question, Dale, just because I'd wondered about this earlier, and you mentioned it in your testimony, so maybe you know the number. We had the 43-point number come up, $1 billion state and local for tax purposes, and you mentioned homestead exemptions. What is that value in Texas? Do you have any idea?
I don't, but it is in that study, and I can get that for you.
I was just thinking, that or 65 and over freeze.
There's a tax freeze on 65 and over. There's an exemption for disabled veterans. Now we're looking at surviving spouses as well. In addition to the state-mandated $15,000 homestead exemption from school property taxes, there are optional local tax exemptions on homestead property as well.
I mean, just Dean, you mentioned that. I was just curious. I think those numbers are important.
Bill, thank you for your comments and your thoughtful testimony. Let me ask you this. If there are some tax preferences that we know are so important and so popular that they have become an entitlement, what if we just took that off the table? What if we took the homestead exemption, the elderly one, just took it off? Would you be for that?
You're promoting to do that?
No, I'm just saying that. Obviously, there are certain ones. I mean, I know we'd always, just as to make my case, I'm gonna lay out the retailer's exemption, which most states have reformed, by the way. They don't give it at that high of a level as we do in Texas. I mean, I'd love to get a break for paying my taxes on time. I think maybe y'all say give me a break for paying them. With most people, period. You get me? But to go get a preference, go to tax break because you pay what you owe on time, please. or the country club one. I mean, clearly there's some high-cost gas, which started out temporary. So my point is, what if there's some, I'm using those obviously because they have a certain appeal to them, and they tend to offend the sensibilities of some people. The amount, if not the break in and of itself. But what if, we know nobody in their right mind plans on coming back here, and you go get rid of the homestead exemption. What if that one wasn't on the list? Just put it in the bill, other than these. Would you be for it then?
Well, again, I don't think the answer is to look at the exemption. I think it's to look at the tax, because what the homestead exemption does is that tries to alleviate some of the harm that the property tax creates. So I think it's a more appropriate question.
Obviously, we never do
the property tax itself. But I don't have a problem with picking out certain exemptions that may be marginal. In Harris County, we exempt raw cocoa and green coffee, a constitutional amendment that was passed several years ago. I don't have a problem with sunsetting that and looking at it. But, yeah, the more serious exemptions were business, and even that one. I mean, there may be exporters who have made a decision to locate in Houston based on that. And if there is a fear that it goes away, then you've disarmed yourself of a fairly critical economic development tool. Because Louisiana will come in and just say, we guarantee you this is permanent. Texas, you're going to have to hire a lot of people.
Have you looked at how they do it in Washington State and in Oregon, other places where they have this process? I wouldn't just believe it.
Well, my recollection is in Washington, what Dick said, and I may be corrected on this, but they made a recommendation to eliminate the exemption. And to me, that's different from an automatic sunset.
So you'd be for it if it was a recommendation to eliminate it?
I have no problem with study and looking at this and trying to develop a better understanding of the tax. I do have a concern that if you're just looking at exemptions, it looks a little bit like a money hunt as opposed to a policy question as to what is appropriate tax policy. And for that, I think we should look at the tax itself and the exemptions as a part of that.
Thank you.
Good. Any other questions?
So you're against both bills, the SJR as well, for the public to be able to have an opportunity to vote for this?
That's correct.
As they are right now.
Yeah, I mean, again, I support study, and we've been an active part of previous tax studies, and we think there's room to re-engage those. And I would encourage the legislature to consider a reenactment of a blue ribbon panel to look at our tax system. I think there is great value in that.
Given your experience and knowledge, do you have a roundabout estimate on how much is out there in terms of exemptions in the state? 20, 30, 40, 50, $60 billion?
I have no reason to doubt the controller's officially published number on that documents the individual exemptions and identifies them, which puts them at about the $40 billion range.
How much? 40?
The $40 billion. But that's a number that we know publicly and that we're using because it is published. The controller does that analysis every 2 years and presents it to the legislature.
All right.
So I think we know an awful lot more than what we acknowledge.
Okay. Thank you.
But for what we've done with them, we could save some money on all that printing. By the way.
Well, actually, this year I think they published it electronically.
Yeah, that's why we're moving to electronic. Thank goodness. Save some trees. Ronnie?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman and members, thank you for the privilege to be here today. I am Ronnie Volkening. I'm the president of the Texas Retailers Association, and we are testifying in opposition to Senate Bill 140 and SJR 12 today. I'm going to be brief because I'm going to mirror some of Mr. Kramer's comments. One of our concerns is we feel like this proposal is somewhat duplicative and burdensome in that we feel like the tax code provisions are subject to review every 2 years, not every 6 years currently. And as has been already mentioned, that before each session, the LBB does present a report with a whole host of proposals for potential reductions in tax preferences and other things. And I do know for a fact that senators and representatives look at that list, and legislation gets filed to address some of those every session, and we get the chance to defend those every session. So I do think it's not for a lack of certain amount of sunlight on tax preferences that we already are very active in this process. And we think to some extent, I thought you had a good idea, Senator Hager, about maybe the first step is to say, if we don't know all the entire list, a good idea might be to say, let's go find out what the entire list looks like. Secondly, I think as Mr. Kramer alluded to as well, whether it's legitimate or not, I think this when you raises to the level of sunset review and sunset, the threat of sunset, it does create some great uncertainty in the business planning community, and which can have the impact of negatively impacting economic growth and job growth. And there is this concern, whether we'll do it or not, that when you raise it to sunset review, just almost to justify the exercise, we're going to find some way to tweak that tax preference or that tax code section somehow. And financial planners in businesses large and small are very concerned about, are my assumptions 2, 4, 6, 10 years out valid, or is the tax code that I'm relying on to make these long-range plans going to be in place 10 years from now? And we've seen over the last several years how uncertainty in the marketplace hinders economic growth. So I will, and we're also concerned about the process in terms of, as Mr. Kramer mentioned, that this is a largely private process during the interim. The LBV and comptroller do this process without any requirement to visit with the taxpayer, because to cite one recent example, we had a nice visit with Senator Ellis's staff during the interim about a bill, and we pointed out some assumptions that were made by the LBV in making their recommendations that we thought were just erroneous. Had we had that opportunity to visit with the LBV in the process, it might not have come out with the same results. So for those reasons, we do stand opposed to the bill.
Thank you.
If my math is right, the person from Harris County said tax preferences that have been in the tax code since 1876, so that's 137 years. Now, do you know of one, can you point to one that the legislature meeting every 2 years since then, I think? Can you point to one from the GEAR reports, every other report? Can you think of a single one of these tax breaks that has not become an entitlement and has been repealed in 137 years?
No. Mr. Kramer did a better job than I did. He was indicating, yes, there have been some. I'm not as well versed as Mr. Kramer.
Which one, Mr.?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, Senator Ellis, last session there was a repeal of a series of economic development refunds, $10 million, which was a sales tax refund.
Oh, man, thank you.
And in 2006, there was an elimination of the old research and development tax credit, the economic, the capital investment tax credit, the jobs creation tax credit. And in the 1980s, when we were passing tax bills, most of the revenue in those tax bills, much of the revenue, I should say, came from the elimination of exemptions.
Don't tell, I'd just be curious, so since 1876, you can just submit something to the committee, a dollar amount on how much has been repealed.
Well, since 1876, we've passed a lot more taxes than exemptions, but I'll be happy to draw out a schedule for you.
And I'm glad to say I haven't passed any of those tax bills.
I think part of the question, I'm sitting here thinking about it, I don't play golf, so let's just be very clear on that number. So nobody gonna throw no water bottles.
You're missing it. If you hold this bill, you may get an offer.
No, I have no desire. So has nothing to do with me. I don't want to play golf ever. I got other stuff to do. But just sitting here thinking, if it's a municipally owned golf course, well then obviously it's not on the rolls because it's city owned.
And it's public.
And it's public. I think about a lot of development in the Houston area just because it's in Houston's ETJ, Fort Bend County, Harris County, we've got all the mud districts. If there's a green belt in a subdivision, it's usually owned by the mud, so therefore there's hardly any value put on that green belt. It's public, it's within the community there. People walk, ride bikes, and if the individual owns it, then it has a higher tax value to it. So I guess my point is I'm trying to think back. We have businesses, we have homestead, 65, military, we go on of different types of things. It makes me think about those. What about the municipalities? Is that fair? It's a good question. It's a good exercise.
Yeah, because we go to the issue of public versus private.
Make sure
so if it's a private entity, that's right, if it's a private entity, it would be just like my home is private. I'd like to get a little break on it. And I'll let y'all come over there and have tea on my front yard. If I can get tax break on it, I'll do it.
I kind of doubt you would.
I would. Depends on how much it would break.
I doubt you.
Depends on how much it would break. But we're going to hear about that in a second.
Okay.
I can't wait to get to that one.
you.
Chairman, members, thank you for. I'm here on duress. I want you to know that, because the only reason I made my statement long years ago that I would not testify before a Senate committee, but Senator Ellis is kind of prompting me into doing that.
We appreciate the exception to the rule.
Well, we're going to do it because I'd like to clarify some things that Senator Ellis has brought out already. I represent myself mainly, but I also represent TARO, which is the Texas Association of Recreational Alliances, organizations, really. And we're opposed to the bill, and the reason I say that, every one of these exemptions that's now on the books is there for a purpose. It was put there by you and people just like you over the last several years that served in the state government. You have gone through these bills, have gone through testimony, they've been introduced by members who thought there was a good reason, a good cause. They've gone through the hearing process, they've gone through hearings in the House and Senate, they've been on the floor of the House and Senate, and they've been passed and signed by the governor. And it just didn't happen because somebody thought it ought to happen that week. It's happened because there's been a lot of research, and that's one of these exemptions here. Let me tell you, I've been around here long, and I probably should have. Most dangerous thing in the world to do is start changing laws. It's like, the old saying, two things you don't want to see is meat, is sausage, and laws, and that's the absolute truth. And when you start jacking with the tax code, you got a very serious problem, and that's why I'm opposed to it, just for that reason.
Mr. Speaker, I certainly appreciate what you just said. I think both you and I and others have been involved in this process over the years, but one has to think about something that's been in the books for 30, 40, 50, 60 years, and whether or not the purpose for which it was passed at the time is still the same today, and whether or not the support that it got from the legislature lifted them to a point where they're doing well, they're doing extremely well, maybe in some cases, and they shouldn't have an opportunity to get in line like the rest of us do to pay our taxes. I'm just a very small businessman, but you know what? I can show you the amount of taxes I pay, and you'd be startled. You say, how can you pay so much when your business doesn't make very much money? I'm at that level where I pay extraordinary amount of taxes. I'm going to break it down one of these days to bring it with me to show others are making much. They have multi-million-dollar operations, and they're not paying what we consider their fair share to address the issues that are on the table here, be it public education, health care, whatever. I think it'd be healthy for us to have a nice, clean, cut picture of what exists in this state without saying that once we give a helping hand to a certain business or operation, that helping hand should be there forever. I mean, I certainly don't agree that a family that lives in a housing authority should be there generation after generation after generation, receiving entitlements. They should educate their children. They should, improve the quality of life and make them more productive citizens, I should say. I'm critical to that. I'm having a hard time understanding that something we do in the legislature is forever. You and I know that nothing's forever, including our lives. So
that's true. Anyway,
it's something that's just going through my head right now. I came in a little late, didn't hear all the preliminary testimony and presentation made, but it seems to me that it would be very healthy for us to look at what we're giving preference to and whether or not that merits our consideration for the future. I think that's where we're going here, aren't we?
Senator, I hear what you're saying. I think my concern is that if you identify those individual things, they should be addressed. The concern I have is when you have a hodgepodge of items like we're talking about here, where you throw everything out there. it's a very dangerous position to be in for everyone. I mean, you don't know what the attitude and the mood of the people is going to be that particular moment, how they're going to vote on the House floor, what's going to be eliminated, it should not be eliminated, what's going to be added, should not be added. So that's what I'm saying is you're on a very slippery slope here when you start doing something like Senator Ellis is proposing. And that's a personal opinion of mine. I think it's just bad government, but that's just my personal opinion. I've been here this is not the first time we've looked at this. We looked at it back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and it's the conclusion I know I came to back when I was in the legislature is that's a slippery slope to get into.
Well, I would hate to set up a system where we just pick and choose the ones that we think we ought to be looking at. We ought to just look at the whole picture.
Well,
put everything on the table.
The comptroller does that. They pick and choose. I mean, they're the one that looks at things and should be giving indications on what's good and what's bad.
But I also think that we ought to be looking at what prior legislatures have done. I mean, reforms take place in education and everything that we do, how we're affected, by state government. A lot of reforms take place, and those reforms are, I guess, change the things that have been done by prior legislators. All I'm saying is that I think this is a very important issue that once and for all we should look at over, especially during the interim, and come back with maybe some healthy recommendations that will bring fairness to the system. That's all I'm looking at.
Yeah. But I'll have to admit, Senator, I've seen proposals that have passed that I didn't agree with. I voted against them when that happened, but they did pass. And so I hear what you're saying. I understand exactly where you're coming from.
Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker.
Now, this one I wasn't looking for.
Speaker,
this is why he got me up here.
I have the utmost respect for you. I won't ask you about that country club.
No.
That you passed. You can talk about that later on your own. But let me ask you this now. When you did a great job as Speaker. 10 years. How long you Speaker?
10 years.
I assume that we had the sunset process. Would you apply your same logic to sunset review? You appointed people to that board. I mean, I'm real proud to inherit the bill.
I eliminate offices. I think I voted against the sunset provision when Senator Doggett or.
But you appointed people to it. You could have put in a bill as Speaker. You probably could have put in a bill to review it. So you against that sunset review process in state agents?
Am I against it?
Yes.
Surprisingly, I was at the time it was proposed, but surprisingly, I think it has worked fairly well.
I think over time, if I get this passed, I think you'll look back and if you remember a country club while you're over there playing, y'all be just fine over there.
I'm like Senator Hager. I don't play golf anymore. I did it one time, but if you would want to play golf with me, I'll play golf with you, and I'm not a good golfer.
Well, they told me I'm not playing.
We'll take. I bet I can get you on a couple of courses in Fort Worth. I don't know about Houston.
I'm told that I'll really never know how bad my golf game is until I'm out of the legislature.
Well, we're going to have to bring Senator Lucio along with us to show us how.
So to move on and get finished so I can tend to my next business and wrap this up, you two go play, send me some pictures, and we'll move on. Eric, do you want to?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
And thanks, Senator. My name is Eric Hartman. I'm here on behalf of the Texas AFT. That's the Texas branch of the American Federation of Teachers, with 65,000 plus members in 800 plus districts and community colleges around the state. Our members have been looking forward to supporting legislation like this for some time, and we're grateful that there's a hearing on it today. We're supporting both parts of this legislative package, and the substitute sounds even better than the original from our standpoint. We believe that cumulatively, the legislature, in granting and then maintaining through inertia many, many tax breaks, has been making decisions about the allocation of billions and billions of dollars. We've heard the numbers from the Comptroller's recent report. Those decisions need to be on the table along with the appropriations decisions as far as we're concerned, when you all are making decisions, very hard decisions about how much you're going to be investing in Texas school children. So we think it's extremely important that there be in place some action-forcing mechanism that exposes these past decisions to review and potential repeal if that seems warranted as the legislature completes a review. I just want to single out a couple of examples. One that Senator Ellis, you already alluded to, the timely filer discount. When we describe to our members the timely filer discount and the fact that in 14-15 biennium, $245 million will be foregone on the basis that we have to reward people to pay to forward sales tax collections on time. People really wonder about the policy logic behind that. It may have made sense when we were instituting the sales tax in 1961 with the technology available then that a 0.5% tax break for timely forwarding of sales tax collections to the state made some sense, but that level of a tax break for performing that service now seems excessive, and I think the LBB in one of the reports that's been mentioned has even said as much, and staff has recommended that that be whittled down significantly. The other big example that I wanted to draw your attention to that we think is very ripe for review concerns the exclusion from the sales tax of many, many professional services. The sales tax, when it was instituted 50-some-odd years ago, did not touch services. Over time, some services have been brought under it. But annually, more than $6 billion is foregone because of professional services that are not subject to the sales tax. And this is over a span of time when our tax base has really moved substantially from goods production to service, to the provision of services. So we are no longer capturing as substantial a proportion of our overall economic activity in this state under the sales tax as we used to do. So this seems very ripe to review for us. And even if you decided, for example, to continue the exclusion from the sales tax of healthcare services, which we would recommend as sort of a lifeline approach to the dealing with the sales tax issue, even if you continued the exclusion for healthcare, you'd have more than $4 billion a year in foregone sales tax revenue because we're not reaching professional services. So we think that list, which you'll find in the Comptroller's Tax Incidence Report, is very much ready for your scrutiny. And I would just note one more thing about the Tax Incidence Report. In that list, she acknowledges that it's not a comprehensive list. It's referred to as a selected list. And I presume that's because of the problem Senator Ellis referred to, which is we're just not absolutely sure we've got the complete list.
Just one question. The figure that I got, I think, was for Harris County alone from the Country Club exemption was $186 million a year. So in a biennium, that's $372 million, not $1,372 million in Harris County, where they had no vote on the local level on whether or not to give that break. So at the very least, you let them decide if they want to do it. And then you said $245 a biennium from the early.
That would be the 14-15 cost of continuing that exclusion. That discount.
Yeah, this is not peanuts we're talking about. I mean, right there, you're talking about over 500. You're talking about right at $500 million just on those two. But look, I thank you for being here, and I thank all of you on both sides. Mr. Chairman, thank you for having a hearing on this bill.
Okay, thank you. So, Eric, I don't have a quorum. Can't move adoption. So I also have Eric, you testified for SJR 12.
That's correct, and SB 140.
SJR 12, Dale, I had a card for you against 12 as well. Okay, is there anybody else who wishes to testify on, for, or against Senate Bill 140 or SJR 12? Being none, public testimony is closed.